Welcome everybody to this September 2023 meeting of the Metropolitan Study Group of the SRIA. And we have quite an international collection of attendees in all kinds of different time zones around the world. So thanks to all of you for making the effort to be here. And thanks for your presence and your input. Today we have, I think it's a co-presentation by both Frater Robert Gordon and Alistair Drew Yates. Now, the title of the presentation is the Coronatio Naturae, or Crowning of Nature. This is a title that I find very, very intriguing, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So what I'm going to do is, I want to, do you need to share the screen?
Yes, we've both got.
Okay, just one second. And so then, without any further faffing around, I have great pleasure in handing over to the both of you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for your time here today. I really hope that you find our presentation an interesting one. Just to check, everybody can see the screen that's coming up, the title slide there. Excellent. We'll be delving into today an important but often overlooked alchemical manuscript that has a lot of relevance to the Rosicrucian tradition, both in the history leading up to the publication of the manifestos, but also to how we might want to explore and practice our tradition today. Now, in the spirit of the Fama Fraternitatis, we have been deepening our knowledge of the hidden mysteries, and so we return with you today to share what we have found. This presentation is the result of Frater Alistair and my own explorations over much of the past year. And the work that we will be looking at is known as the Coronatio Naturae, or Crowning of Nature. And it's a beautiful set of alchemical emblems that come into the historical record towards the end of the 16th century. These emblems depict in quite granular detail the process for the creation of the lapis philosophorum, or philosopher's stone, taking us through the various stages of the process and the creation of both the white and red stones. We believe that this document is a wonderful doorway into what can otherwise be a highly confusing and often impenetrable path. And so I hope we might inspire you through this text to look deeper into the alchemical side of our tradition. Now, there's a lot to cover, and we will be trying to go through it as succinctly as possible. I believe between the two of us combined, it'll be about 1 hour and 20 minutes, the presentation in total. But we hope you will enjoy the detail we are providing today and find it of value to your own studies and efforts. Just go to the next one. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Now, before we delve into the manuscripts themselves, let us take a moment to consider why these kind of explorations are useful today. What purpose is there to not only study alchemy in its historical context, but to seek accessible ways to experience its richness ourselves? I know that there are some here today who are years or even decades into their pursuit of the mysteries contained within the alchemical tradition, and you'll know that the answer begins with something quite straightforward. Alchemy has always been considered a central component of Hermeticism, from which Rosicrucianism emerges and remains closely linked to. It is also something that is prominently referenced in both the Fama and the Confessio Fraternitatis, with the third of the most popular Rosicrucian manifestos, the Chemical Wedding, being almost entirely situated within alchemical allegory and purpose. So not only is it of central importance to our tradition, but it is also something that has become quite detached from how we approach our spiritual path today. This is primarily because over the centuries, particularly from the 17th century onward, alchemy becomes separated into a number of its constituent parts. What was once a holistic tradition that unified many disciplines, today we tend to see alchemy as either an historical curiosity and precedent to modern chemistry and medicine, a mystical pursuit veiled in operative allegory, or in more recent times, a purely symbolic construct that discusses personal psychology and the makings of the human mind. While all of these components are present within the alchemical tradition and can be fruitfully studied and applied, it is our contention that by once again unifying these disparate parts, by reconstituting the initial substance that they were all drawn from, that we can restore alchemy to its rightful place as a jewel in the crown of the Hermetic tradition and uncover what lies at the core of this mystery in a mystery, as Chaucer called it, that still remains of utmost relevance to us today. Alchemy is a path that contains many things that modern Rosicrucians are seeking. A great deal of textual analysis, liber librum aperit, one book opens another. The intellectual pursuit of knowledge, deep mystical contemplation, and practical effort requiring focus and dedication. All of this, as well as replicable results that can be handed down from generation to generation, however obscurely veiled they may of necessity have been. When you consider these different elements alongside its historical importance in the formation of the modern world, we can see how alchemy is a path that truly brings us right into the heart of the Rosicrucian tradition in a uniquely appropriate way. Now, having said this, and before moving on, there are some important disclaimers to take into account. To begin with, alchemy is a highly complex and difficult path to pursue. This is made even more difficult by the fact that it is not a monolithic tradition. The same symbol or term can mean different things, depending on the author, geography, or timeframes that you were talking about. Even once you get through the obfuscation of coded language and symbolism, in which one term can mean a dozen different things, there are challenging and precise practical processes that require a lot of time and practice to get right, not to mention cost. Not only this, but many of the later avenues of alchemy from a laboratory perspective can actually be quite dangerous, with extreme measures of heat applied to highly volatile compounds or resulting substances and reactions that might be poisonous or fill the air with toxic fumes or both. For all of these reasons, it has long been a tradition that relies upon mentorship and with the obscurity of many alchemical texts often accompanied by a more direct form of learning that comes from a teacher-student dynamic. So with those disclaimers in place, I would also add a personal disclaimer of my own, which is that I consider myself an absolute novice in the practice of alchemy. Everything presented here is done with the mindset of sharing some findings along the way so that we might learn from one another's pursuits in these matters. With all that considered, let's take a moment to think about what alchemy meant in the early modern period. Even within this bracket, there is a huge amount of variation, indeed enough detail alone to fill entire books, and I would recommend the works of Lawrence Principi and Jennifer Rampling here. But it at least lets us hone in a little on the context within which the Coronatio Naturae manuscripts emerge in the 16th century. Firstly, we are inherently talking about the European alchemical tradition, which builds upon texts that were brought over from the Arabic and Islamic traditions and begin to be translated around the 12th century. These build upon core methods of metallurgy, pigmentation, and the pyrolysis process in general that date back to the ancient era. But the philosophical framework of alchemy in the early modern period really builds upon these works coming over from the Middle East. There is then a huge wave of activity throughout the 13th to 15th centuries of different treatises, translations, commentaries, more commentaries on those commentaries that begin to build up a corpus of alchemical texts. There are way too many here to name check or mention, but they're all trying to navigate the complex and often dangerous path towards understanding the secrets locked inside nature. Now, this is also a period of conflicting opinions about alchemy. As Lawrence Principe has laid out in 2 sections in his book, The Secrets of Alchemy, quote, "Perhaps the most constant feature of early modern chemistry is its stubbornly bifurcated reception and ambiguous reputation. It was both condemned as fraudulent or useless and praised as powerful, even sacred, in almost every context." He then goes on later in the book to say, "It is depicted both as an obsessive pursuit that can lead unwary or unwise followers to ruin, poverty, and immorality, and as a productive labor requiring steady industry, learning, and skill." Alchemy, then, was more likely in many ways to be ridiculed than applauded, even in the early modern period, and usually linked to the idea that practitioners were either fools or fraudulent con artists. From a broader perspective, there was also a legal threat to its practice. The multiplication of metals becomes an issue of politics and economy, with increasing penalties, including death in some areas, associated with even the attempt of discovering such capabilities, let alone their culmination. Even alchemists that were not actively trying to produce counterfeit coinage or metals had to be extremely cautious. For although there were certainly licenses available with attached royal patronage, these too often came with the threat of imprisonment or death should the alchemist fail at their assigned task. Just to be known as an alchemist was therefore not only dangerous in process, but in the social context it existed within. There is good reason why many alchemists hid their work from prying eyes and kept as private as possible. It is also here, and often for this reason of prosecution, that we begin to see the medicinal aspects of alchemy come to the forefront during this time. These could be discussed and pursued more openly. There was less risk of being labeled a fraud or put under severe penalty. Thus, a more medicinal approach becomes prominent during this time, often connected to the church and monastic orders, and closely linked with the distillation of spirits and tinctures for their distinct medicinal benefits. The 16th century was thus a culmination of all that the alchemical tradition had brought under its wing, from metallurgy and pharmacology through to economic pursuits and a growing use of alchemical imagery within the religious context of the church that was often used to discuss theology and mystical relationships with the divine. All of this is an incredibly simplified view of the context within which this document, the Coronatio Naturae, emerges. A time in which alchemy is starting to be pulled in different directions. This truly was a crowning moment of all that had come before, after which the different aspects of the tradition, at least as disseminated throughout Europe, become more separated and distinct in character. Whether that be the scientifically focused pursuit of chemical experimentation, the focus on a mystical theology that spoke of personal union with the divine, or the medicinal pursuits that were famously popularized posthumously by the works of Paracelsus, whom we know is one of the few people referenced directly in the Rosicrucian manifestos that immediately follow this period. Which brings us to looking at the different manuscripts of the Coronatio Naturae to see what insight a comparison might provide as to its meaning and purpose. There are approximately 45 existing manuscripts that have been catalogued and are in archives today, known primarily thanks to the efforts of Adam McLean, whom people will know from his alchemy website, who published the Emblems in the 1980s and has materials up on his website to this day. At least one copy is known through private sale auctions, while the vast majority are held in library archives, and of those primarily in Scotland and England. There is a wide range of dates for the hand-drawn manuscript copies. There's an indication in one of the manuscripts that it originates from the 17th year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, which would place the earliest date associated with these emblems to 1575. Interestingly, the manuscript versions are split about 50-50 into those which contain accompanying written commentary and those which just contain the series of images alone. Of those which contain images, they are usually either a series of 40 or 67 images, roughly, i.e. ending at the creation of the white stone at emblem 40, or those which continue on to show the whole process of creating the red stone. You can see here on the slide, emblem 40 on the left in black and white with the cracked vessel as they would take out the white stone at that point. And then on the next, the true crowning of the creation of the red stone at the end of the process. Although there are a number of different versions which also contain additional emblems surrounding this core set, which we will take a brief look at in a moment. So the fact that many of the earlier manuscripts in particular do not contain the written commentary text gives us a sense that this commentary text was perhaps added at a later date. Notably, of those copies which do include the entire process to its end, there is no associated commentary for the final stages, lending more evidence that it was perhaps first added to copies that had the reduced series. It is a relatively accessible commentary of the process depicted, providing evidence that allows us to place the Coronatio Naturae within a particular path of the alchemical tradition known as the wet way, more specifically the so-called Lullian art, as inspired by the body of text under the pseudo-Lull name. And this was evolved and championed by the English clergyman/alchemist George Ripley, and more specifically that part of the wet way which would come to be known today as the acetate path. It's also worth noting that a number of the manuscripts contain only the commentary text, with gaps left empty for the illustrations, presumably left to be filled in at a later date by an author that did not complete their study or perhaps did not even begin to practice the processes depicted. There are also a number of different titles associated with the manuscripts, from the Coronatio Naturae, or crowning of nature, that it has come to be known as collectively, but also the Angelorum Opus, the work of the angels, and Sapientia Veterum, the wisdom of the ancients. And this might possibly hearken to Francis Bacon's text of the same name that was published in 1609. These different naming variations mean that it is quite likely additional versions of the manuscript do remain uncatalogued. So if any of you ever come across a manuscript and you recognize any of these images, make sure to check if it adds to those currently known. I'm certain there are more out there to be discovered. Finally, the majority of existing manuscripts are currently located in archives within the United Kingdom, specifically at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and the Wellcome Collection in the British Library in London. And there's a few other manuscripts located around England, and then potentially about a third of the manuscripts are located in various archival collections around the world. By comparing these manuscripts, and we have now personally, between Alistair and myself, looked at over 30 of them, it is possible to group them into clear lineages based on unique illustrations and textual items that carry over across some copies and not others. Now, here are some images from different manuscripts that are held in the Ferguson collection at the University of Glasgow. You can see a few variations on this page, including the top left image, which has the associated commentary text, whereas the top right is the emblem images only. The manuscript shown in the two images on the bottom shows a layout that a small number use, doubling up on the illustrations on each page, and this kind of layout would go on to influence the printed publication by Johann Barchusen in 1718, which we will also look at, which puts 4 or sometimes even 5 emblems on a single printed page. 5 more examples here of different manuscripts showing the richness of the illustrations, including a comparison on the left between versions of the distillation image placed early in the series, an earlier manuscript without associated text on the bottom left, and a later version with the commentary running alongside. In the top right corner, you can see the manuscript with pinprick holes on the back side, and these are used to facilitate copying of the images. This is the only manuscript that contains these pinpricked holes, and this version is evidently one of the earlier sources of many later versions that share a lot of similar design elements. And there's also an example on the bottom right of a smaller side version of the manuscript that has empty spaces, as you can see, that would have had the emblem illustrations added, but the owner of this manuscript never completed them. And finally, the central image is quite a unique one, in which the emblems are each in very small form, maybe about an inch high. And interestingly, this version is not completed and stops relatively early on, around stage 14 of the full set of 60 empty circles that it has ready and available. And the way that the symbolism and the notation is done on these emblems suggests that it potentially indicates an individual was going through the stages themselves and reached a certain point. So, having seen the kind of variety that can be found when examining the different manuscript versions of the Coronatio Naturae, and I hope you'll agree it is a fantastic document, the question arises as to what kind of insight can we gain from comparing them. Consistent across all versions, and perhaps one of the more recognizable images, is the opening depiction of the prima materia. This depiction of the starting point to the Philosopher's Stone is both symbolically detailed while also holding back many fundamental secrets, such as the base material that would be used to get to this point, a key to the entire process that would be handed down through oral tradition. Looking from another angle, it might be because the process is a universal one that can be applied to any material from which the generative seed can be isolated. Whichever way you consider it, this foundational aspect makes the depiction of the prima materia one of the most important emblems of the series, representing, as it does, the beginning of the philosophical work. We can see through this comparison that there are components that differ, particularly when it comes to the surrounding titling and text. For example, in many versions, the emblem is titled with the phrase Chaos Veterum or De Chao Veterum, the chaos of the ancients, and presents itself as the first heading of the text. However, in others, there are variations, including the previously mentioned Angelorum Opus, and then the following text, Octure Hermete Philosophorum Peritissimo, the work of angels by the author Hermes, the most expert philosopher. In some of these Angelorum Opus versions, there is also Hebrew text along the bottom, you might see there right on the left, which it's quite evocative and we might presume relates to some Kabbalistic concept, but on translation appears to be a bookplate name, William Waldie Library. Not the carrier of esoteric information we might have hoped for, but a clue nonetheless as to the provenance of some of these manuscripts. Continuing the use of explanatory text, many of the manuscripts explicitly state in the middle that the central substance depicted is the prima materia, with a few spelling variations, and then also go on to give the breakdowns of the planetary symbols surrounding it. And on the external side, you can see on the leftmost two, they are also surrounded in terms of whether they are masculine, feminine, and then combined with one of the four temperaments: choleric, sanguine, melancholic, and phlegmatic. Importantly, the order of the 7 planets that surrounds the prima materia across the different manuscripts remains almost exclusively the same, with Saturn in the primary ascendant position. This is also outlined in the accompanying commentary text. Quote, "The first of these is Saturn and therefore is placed in the ascendant, but he contains all the other planets as the others do the rest, but in a diverse order. From hence it is known that all things are in all things according to the true philosophical intention." Now, I know there are some adept astrologers listening here today, so it's beyond my pay grade, but if you have a look at the different planets in circulation, the order of the planets within each planet is different, and I'm sure there is something to unlock there about the work. Thus, from the prima materia, we have the separation of the elements and then the expansion into the 7 planetary spheres, in alchemical terms seen as analogous to the 7 metals: lead, tin, iron, copper, mercury, silver, and gold. that revolve in circulation, starting with Saturn, and each contain within them a circulation of the planets in diverse order, fulfilling the opening text found in many versions, which states that the process is one in which we gather the 4 elements by a concordance of the 7 planets. Within the opening emblems in most of the manuscripts, there is also an indication that the process has a 3-fold nature, with an emblem showing 3 different kingdoms: vegetable, animal, and mineral. This notion of the 3 kingdoms is an important concept, dating back to ancient times, and there are a number of different ways it might be considered. The accompanying text that runs alongside in the Coronatio explains that, quote, "Again, the philosopher's stone is metallic matter, converting the substance and forms of imperfect metals. That this conversion is not done by its like is long ago agreed by all philosophers. It is therefore necessary that the stone be got out of a metallic matter, to wit our mercury, which is all that which is so sought for by the wise men, and lieth hid in our mercury, although this mercury may be termed 3-fold, from whence 3 principal stones are known by philosophers, the mineral of the wise men, or the mineral, animal, and vegetable stone of them, 3-fold in name, 1 in being." It also then nods to the Rosarium Philosophorum, when it goes on to state that, "Whereupon saith one of the ancients, there are 3 stones and 3 salts, of which the whole magistry consisteth." Now, going back to look at the Rosarium itself for further light on this, the Rosarium implores that the work of the alchemists be conducted within the realms of nature. Quote, "Therefore let your exercise and labor be used in nature, because our stone is of an animal, of a vegetable, and of a mineral substance." The 3-fold aspect presented here is kind of ambiguous, but does seem to indicate that the 3 kingdoms come together as one within the stone. This approach is supported by an earlier text, popular among alchemists in the early modern period, authored under the pseudonym Hortonalius, that was a commentary on the Emerald Tablet. On the 3 kingdoms, Hortonalius states, "For this cause is the stone said to be perfect, because it hath in it the nature of minerals, vegetables, and animals. For the stone is 3, and one having 4 natures, to wit, the 4 elements, and 3 colors, black, white, and red." So again, similar to the affirmation in the Rosarium, there is an indication that the 3 kingdoms are unified within the stone. However, and nothing in alchemy is ever easy, we also know from modern alchemical practice that there are considered to be multiple stones. Beginning alchemists are recommended today to start within the vegetable kingdom, culminating in the creation of the plant stone that is said to be able to extract the quintessence from other plants, similar to a magnetic effect. That we have a separate stone from the vegetable or plant kingdom is an interesting contrast to the notion that the 3 kingdoms are held within the one philosopher's stone. We can hold these things side by side, of course, as just because we can produce a plant stone does not mean it is to the exclusion of the idea that the philosopher's stone contains all 3 kingdoms within itself. But it's worth considering when we contemplate on the meaning of this emblem. We can also add here the historical perspective given by Jennifer Rampling, that there is, quote, "a notion inherited from Arabic alchemy that more than one kind of stone existed, each stone made using different materials and targeted toward different ends." Dissecting the notion of the 3 kingdoms in alchemy is a vast subject on its own, but it's important to point out this emblem, not only because there are different ways to interpret the concept itself, but also because in many examples, and I've shown 2 kind of variations here, 2 on the left as one grouping, 2 on the right as another grouping. The emblem only seems to indicate on the left the vegetable and mineral kingdoms, as shown by the trees and the layers of ground that they rest upon. However, in other examples, such as those 2 seen on the right, we can see the clear indication of a severed human leg. This was not an uncommon symbol of the animal kingdom, but it's worth noting that the majority of examples of the Coronatio Naturae manuscript do not display this aspect clearly. Indeed, many of them admit it entirely, or if it is included, it's abstracted into a form that is barely recognizable, an artifact perhaps of the copying process and the degradation of the symbols occurring over many iterations. And you can see how the two symbols on the left are clearly coming from the same copied source, and the two symbols on the right are clearly coming from the same copied source. Another aspect to examine are attributes which appear to be unique to specific copies or series of copies. One that is often noted, previously mentioned, is MS Ferguson 8, which contains these small pinpricks outlining the emblems and thereby facilitating the copying of the images. This is one of the indications that the emblems were used and handed down through some kind of society or school of alchemists, as it is clear that this manuscript was used to facilitate copying. There are a number of other unique images and text editions, including the highly evocative and striking closing image of the throned perfection radiating its influence of Sol, radiating its influence into the other planetary spheres through the action of projection. We see this concept of projection well known within alchemy, not only in this final image, which you can see here in the bottom right, but also in almost all of the other manuscripts in Emblem 40, which is where many of them end. Thus, we have two stages of projection in the full series, in which the white and the red stone must be tested respectively. As George Ripley states in the Compound of Alchemy, also known as the 12 Gates, it is here that, quote, in projection it shall be proved if our practice be possible. There are numerous other unique emblems, and I've only shown a few of the probably few dozen that are available. And one of them, which is interesting, is this Astrologia Terrestrius image on the left, which is included in one manuscript before the Prima Materia. There is also a grouping of manuscripts that include the image of a seated man, right at the end, surrounded by Latin terms denoting phrases that the alchemist should embody: calm, prudence, knowledge, wealth, honors, pity, liberty, etc. This emblem can also be seen as evidence that what we are working with here is the Lullian art, or at least was presumed to be the Lullian art, as the seated man has clear similarities to other depictions we have available of Raymond Lull. Another set of unique emblems that we see in a handful of versions are depictions of the Athanor that the alchemist would use. Indeed, such a depiction, relatively rare among the manuscripts, makes its way into the eventual printed series that you can see in black and white there, published in 1718, thereby becoming fixed from that point. This is of interest for two main reasons. Firstly, because it shows us that this was considered an inherently practical instruction. The Athanor is not depicted in a way that leans into the allegory of such symbolism, although of course that is always present, but rather into a more instructional illustration of the setup the alchemist would use in their own laboratory. One other aspect is that the Athanors in early manuscripts that you can see on the left show 3 philosophical eggs, pointing back to the idea that the 3 kingdoms might be referring to 3 separate stones. In the later printed version, this has been reduced to one larger vessel, adding further, of course, to the ambiguity of the 3 kingdoms. Either way, the indication is of a practical process conducted with a real furnace, not just a purely allegorical one produced within the Athanor of our own soul. Beyond the addition of unique images, we also have marginalia and written text. There are many examples of this, such as a later manuscript held at Alnwick Castle that has marginalia stating that they believe this manuscript to have been Uranius Philaletes' own writings, i.e. George Starkey, who was alive well after the earliest examples of the Coronatio. However, we might consider there whether the textual commentary could have been added during his time, a question to consider. And numerous notes about the provenance of certain manuscripts, where they came from, who purchased them, for how much, from which London bookseller, all of these kinds of things are left as notes in some of these manuscripts. There's also, as you see on the bottom right, a title page that accompanies many of the versions, and particularly those that become known under the title Sapientia Veterum. Seen on the bottom here, that outlines the purpose of the work and also, importantly, links it with many of the cohabiting elements of the alchemical tradition, including Kabbalah. Last for today, but not least, is an end page in the top right here on one manuscript that states that this is the recapitulation of the Magistry of Raymond Lull, further helping us to link the emblems with a specific alchemical path from a certain time period within its vast history. Now, a vital element among different manuscripts is the inclusion of names of the angelic hierarchies. Frater Alistair is going to look at this in more detail, but different stages of the process are linked to different levels of the angelic hierarchy: Principatus, Potentatus, Throni, Virtutus. This is evidently of primary importance, particularly given the title Angelorum Opus that accompanies many of the manuscript versions. And it tracks with alchemy's role as a central component of the Hermetic tradition more broadly. It reminds us that this is a holy art that bridges the personal, natural, and celestial realms. The cosmological and theological context of the emblems is thus placed firmly within the traditions from which Rosicrucianism emerges. Indeed, we can see direct correlations, not only in Robert Flood's well-known Anima Mundi illustration with the golden chain, first printed in 1617, which has, if you look very closely, alchemical retorts right at the very center of it, but also with what's titled the Scala Philosophorum diagram included in the Geheime Figuren der Rosenkreuzer of the late 18th century. On the right here, you can see this diagram entitled Scala Philosophorum, Scale of the Philosophers, and you can see the relationship between different stages of the Hermetic process of spiritual progression. From the material items at the bottom, salt, vitriol, salniter, antimony, etc., to the metals in the second level, gold, silver, copper, tin, to the planetary spheres, before arriving in the angelic hierarchies that emanate directly from the source of all existence, the divine Yod-He Vav-He. That the angelic hierarchies listed here in this highest layer of the scale match the ones included in the Coronatio Naturae shows us that these emblems exist as part of the Hermetic tradition and the foundations our Rosicrucian tradition rests upon. Indeed, angelical wisdom is attained by it, as the Coronatio itself states in the opening commentary text. The fact that the Scala Philosophorum was also the name of a 15th century alchemical text by Guido Montanor, whom George Ripley was influenced by along with Raymond Lull, I would suggest is not merely a coincidence. I've also included a quote from another well-known alchemical treatise, The Golden Chain of Homer, which gives us some perspective on how the orders of angels graduate from degree to degree, passive towards an exceedingly more sublime and subtle nature. Now, I've mentioned what's known as the Barchusen print, which puts the Coronatio Naturae into a fixed form in the 18th century to be disseminated more widely. Johann Conrad Barchusen was a professor at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, born in 1666 and passing away in 1723. He is said to be the first person to teach chemistry as a subject separate from medicine, so can be seen as a really important figure operating at the transition point between the alchemical tradition as handed down from ancient times and modern understandings of its separate components of chemistry, metallurgy, pharmacology, etc. The book in which the full series of emblems was published in 1718 is titled Elementa Chemia and was actually the second edition of his earlier work entitled, appropriately enough, Pyro Sophia, which was published in 1698. To which he added the emblems of the Coronatio Naturae as a closing chapter. The first title of the book, Pyro Sophia, gives us another indication that what we are talking about here is the pyrolytic process, that changes the composition of metals through raising their temperatures, thereby causing them to vibrate at higher rates, breaking down the bonds between complex molecules. Alchemy, of course, takes this further and seeks to recombine the results of this process with an incalculable number of possible outcomes, while also taking into account the parallel spiritual processes that are occurring at the same time. The Barchusen print is not only notable for being the vehicle within which these emblems see wider dissemination, and you'll see these in modern books such as the Alchemy and Mysticism book from the publisher Taskin, for example, but also because it adds a number of unique emblems of its own. It drops the references to specific angelic hierarchies, but adds many other elements of spiritual symbolism, and so still does package the whole series in a clearly sacred context. We can see here many of the emblems that this Barchusen print adds, which have similarity to the 17th century symbolism from Michael Meyer and his Atalantafugians, including the use at the closing of musical notation to praise the glory of God and multiple uses of the tetragrammaton, which is notably not present in the original Coronatio Naturae manuscripts. Importantly, though, as we've shown with the inclusion of the Athanor print in the Barchusen series, the placement of these emblems within the wider book of instructions from the Pyrolytic tradition again places the Coronatio Naturae firmly into the sphere of having a practical, hands-on component and not merely an internal mystical process. The two are inseparable if we are to find the true core of the alchemical tradition. Alchemy has had a long and dualistic reputation, many considering it completely worthless and fraudulent, while some of history's greatest minds have been immersed in the search to unlock a deeper understanding of the universe. One such illustrious figure was none other than Isaac Newton. Although this aspect of his work was long de-emphasized and indeed outright censored by academia, we know from recent years that Newton saw alchemy as a central part of his own great work. With the collation of his handwritten documents now available online, it has been suggested that approximately 10% of Newton's writings deal directly with the topic of alchemy. One handwritten note is of particular relevance to us, as you can see here. Found among documents purchased, funnily enough, by economist John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s, this page in Newton's handwriting outlines what is titled Lapis Philosophicus cum sui rotus elementalibus, the philosopher's stone with its elemental wheels, or perhaps with its rotation of the elements. I have seen this image linked with the depiction of the alchemical processes shown on the famous Ripley scrolls. However, I'm pleased to state today that we have found the source of this image and can trace it back to a specific manuscript of the Coronatio Naturae, MS Dresden 36, held in an archive in Germany. The images match perfectly, including the full title text, the various components and shading of the illustration, and the inclusion of the temperaments around the outside. We can therefore state with confidence that Isaac Newton himself sat with a manuscript version of the Coronatio Naturae, and not just a printed Barchusen version, which does not contain the same elements in the prima materia emblem. And he found it of importance in his own alchemical work. I was intrigued by the fact that the purchaser of the documents was the economist and social philosopher John Maynard Keynes. What did Keynes of Keynesian economics see of such importance in these documents? It turns out that his appreciation for the esoteric runs deeply as well, as can be seen in this quote from a talk that he was to present at the Royal Society of London. Keynes passed away just a few months beforehand, and so the speech was posthumously delivered by his brother. But in this address, Keynes states that Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians, the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last great mind which looked out on the visible and intellectual world with the same eyes as those who began to build our intellectual inheritance rather less than 10,000 years ago. Why do I call him a magician? Because he looked on the whole universe and all that is in it as a riddle, as a secret which could be read by applying pure thought to certain evidence, certain mystic clues which God had laid about the world to allow a sort of philosopher's treasure hunt to the esoteric brotherhood. Striking words indeed from one of the 20th century's most influential thinkers in commemoration of one of the forefathers of the modern world. It's worth noting how closely this perspective fits with the works of other esotericists of Newton's era, such as Michael Meyer, who states in Atalanta Fugiens, "For the purpose of cultivating our intellect, God has hidden infinite secrets in nature. Chemical secrets are not the least of these, but are, after the investigation of divine things, the first and most previous of all." I'm also reminded here of the words in the Confessio Fraternitatis. Although that great book of nature stands open to all, yet there are but few that can read and understand the same. All of this to show you, I hope, that the Coronatio Naturae is perhaps one of the most detailed depictions we have of the alchemical tradition and its crowning goal. But if it is a mystery within a mystery, a riddle that we might put our intellect towards to unlock the mystical secrets at the heart of creation, then our progress will require some clues, a way to begin to understand what is depicted and how we can approach it. The first key will be different for everyone, but for me, it came through the image of the toad, one familiar to anybody who has seen a Ripley scroll. Not only this, but one emblem in particular matches the lines from the vision of Sir George Ripley as found in Ashmole's Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum. "A toad full ruddy I saw did drink the juice of grapes so fast, till overcharged with the broth his bowels all to burst." And thus the journey into the Coronatio Naturae began proper, the beginning of what will no doubt be a path that we must keep traveling for the rest of our days. I hope that you've enjoyed this first introduction to the Coronatio Naturae and the mysteries it contains. One of the most evocative elements of the Emblems and its associated commentary is that there is no authorship attached, not even of the usual pseudonymous kind that links important works to the names of great masters of the past. The manuscript was a jewel of private alchemical circles in the early modern period, truly the crowning culmination of the tradition as it had evolved over millennia up until that time. Many questions still remain that Frater Alistair and myself are committed to try and answer. Questions such as what process is depicted and where does it come from? Did this belong to a particular school or circle of alchemists? And perhaps most interestingly to many of us here today, can we put into practice what these emblems are depicting? I personally have learned so much from the discussions and mentorship of Frater Alistair in these areas. So I'm now delighted to hand over to him to help us uncover some of the depth that lies behind these emblems, to see if we might be able to reconstruct the processes they are depicting and continue to use them today in search of the greatest esoteric treasure of them all, the Philosopher's Stone. Thank you very much, and over to you, Alistair.
Very short comment. Some of the images that you shared there, Rob, really remind me of a terrarium. You know, the teardrop-shaped vessel. But I was, while you were speaking, I was looking at images of various terrariums with things growing on the inside.
Well, I'm sure there's something in that, right?
Yes, yeah.
A microcosm of nature.
Absolutely.
Rob, while you get this ready,
Yes.
would you like me to share some thoughts about what you've said?
Yeah, no, please do. We're just
Yes.
waiting to see whether Alistair will reconnect or whether we can hear him. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
Continue with the discussion from here.
So here's what I'm fascinated by. And Rob won't be surprised by this. In fact, no one here will be. This manuscript mentions Raymond Lull, who, of course, had a practice which involved meditation on different letters which represented different things, which were memorized in a circle. And then there were certain processes you'd go through to turn those wheels or to go through different stages. So now we have this alchemical manuscript, which is most certainly meant for a practical process, but it also mentions Raymond Lull. And a lot of these symbols are arranged in Lullian style circles. Now, this is really exciting to me because it could imply a meditative process that you should take place. If you applied Lullian techniques to this manuscript, you'd be going through each symbol, meditating on each one of the individual points until your heart really connected with them, and then following that path all the way through. And that's how Raymond Lull would do it. And that's what it implies to me straight away. I think, wow. And now, this isn't to say this is not a manual for making something physical. It is. I just don't think they made such distinguishing processes. You know, they didn't say this is physical, this is spiritual, this is animal, this is mineral. It was for everything. And of course, I'm tempted to have a go. You know, it would be really interesting to see what happens if you do that. What change happens in the different parts of you if you start to connect with them through meditation and join them together in this process. What's everyone else's thoughts? And Rob, are you ready to do the next bit?
Well, absolutely. I would say that's a lot of that is covered by Alistair's next section.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Perfect
I've been your
introduction.
interlude and your introduction.
Exactly. So, okay, Alistair, I'm gonna share my screen then and get these up.
My laptop decided to die.
Of course, as it would do. Can everybody see this now as a PDF?
Yep.
All right, so I will scroll down to the next one when you tell me to, Alistair.
So thank you everybody for your time. Excuse the technical issues, sod's law. And really interesting at the same time to hear your observations, Martin. And it was Raymond Lull that really brought me here, in a sense. And we're definitely on the same wavelength. And let's begin. So when Frater Rob first sent me a WhatsApp message, gosh, about 6 months ago, he sent me an image of one of the emblems and asked me what did I think it represented, what path was it depicting. Having done some practical work, I put my hand up here and say I'm not an adept of the royal art. I've not achieved the stone, but I do practice. And really, when Rob posed some questions for me, it allowed me to take a step back and really start to delve into the manuscript, the different versions, and see what is it really telling us from a practical standpoint. Does it represent a path to the stone? Does it depict every single stage? So this is really what the nature of my aspect of this talk will be, and hopefully it goes somewhat smoothly from here. So Rob, hopefully if you could just move to the next slide. So these, I'd probably say the four main enigmas when we explore alchemy. That could be a text, any form of alchemical emblems or alchemical plates. And the first one would be, what path is being depicted? We know within the alchemical tradition, there are various paths to the stone. Frater Rob mentioned there's different kingdoms and each of those kingdoms have a stone. And this was one of the first things that we wanted to really identify. And the next one being, is the sequence of the emblems correct? We know this is another one of the things that was veiled by the alchemists. We see that in the Mutus Liber. We see it in the Rosarium Philosophorum. So we just wanted to understand, okay, is that the case here? For me, it's pretty clear initially that it represents a practical path. That big question then was, is it the correct order? And And of course, in the emblems, we see various titles and decknamen that are used. So what I want to try and to do here is just pick out a couple of those and help us understand how they inform us about what path this might be representing, but also essential keys to the alchemical tradition, and what I call, or what we kind of call now, the ancient tradition, because we really do see this as the crowning of the ancient tradition. And as Frater Rob mentioned, seeing it as a holy art, I think that was the thing that's come across the strongest about this. And anyone that's practiced alchemy will know the experience that you go through and how it changes you. But there's also another side to alchemy, which we see in modern days with the rise of social media, where you have people sharing pictures that look absolutely brilliant. But the way in which they go about the work is more chemical, shall we say, rather than alchemical. And this manuscript highlights it for me, just how do we restore alchemy back to being a holy art, an initiatic art, whereby we can evolve ourselves and experience some of these things, as you kind of alluded to, Martin. And then the big question we hear about in alchemy, what is the crude matter? So Rob mentioned about the prima materia. We know there's a slight difference, and it's one of those secrets that's been closely guarded. It's been written about loads. So we want to talk about what potentially is that crude matter. What do we believe that that is in regards to Coronatio Naturae? Okay. So here you can see, I can't see the complete screen, so I'm hoping that everybody else can. You see an overview of just some of the emblems I'm going to talk about. You know, we're limited for time. I would love to explore all of the emblems with you all in due course, God willing. But what I want to do today is really just highlight, give us a brief tour where we delve into a little bit more detail. And again, like I said, about the practical considerations of some of these emblems and how that might inform us further. Would you like to move to the next slide, please, Rob? So let's begin. But this is the first emblem in the sequence, and Frater Rob's always talked about the title of the image, and it was quite interesting for me, just the way my mind kind of works is I like to separate things, and we know that's the nature of the alchemist. Solve and coagulate, separate and bring back together, coagulate, bring back into one form. And with the layout of this particular emblem or this series in this manuscript, you see this title banner at the top, you see the main emblem depicted in the middle, and then you have a tiny banner at the bottom with its numerical placement. And this is what I found really interesting when I first started to look at it, because one would look at the bottom and they will see its place first, and we think this is the obvious starting point. And I'd like to propose that it is, but it's a half truth. And what I mean by that is, it is the beginning of the work, but of the philosophical work. And this is one of the mysteries of the alchemists, where often in their texts or in their emblems, they would place the philosophical starting point at the beginning. And you'd have to have guidance from an adept or someone that had some experience to tell you, actually, no, this isn't where it begins if we was to do it in real life. Actually, we need to reverse engineer our crude matter back to its primordial state. And Rob, if you slide to the next page, you see here I've zoomed in to the central part, which I feel is the key to that particular emblem. And you see this image of the prima materia depicted in this beautiful way, where if we look into the central point, we see this darkness, this black. And then we see this next layer, which is with almost like waves of water. And then we see another layer, which might represent air or a fume. And then we have these rays coming out of it, which would represent fire. And I find this extremely interesting when pondering the prima materia, because as some of the manuscripts say, The title for this particular emblem in some is Chaos of the Ancients. In others, it changes name. So it's interesting, this idea of the prima materia being the chaos. And what essentially we have to do is reverse engineer our crude matter back to this primordial state. But these four elements really show the four elements in potential. If you'd like to go to the next slide, Rob. So here I've just kind of put it alongside a more modern version or glyph of an alchemical symbol, which is associated with chaos. So here we have the circle, which is that which is without beginning or without end, the eternal. And then we have the quadrature, or the cross, which divides the four elements. And it's essentially, what you're seeing here is the same thing, just depicted in a different way. And the chaos, as I said, is really the starting point for where the philosophical work begins. If you'd like to move to the next slide. I think nothing quite brings it to life than showing you what it looks like in reality. And it's something that is not yet finished. So, you know, as you see these photos, this is a live process that's kind of accompanying our exploration. But what you see here on the left-hand side is a depiction of the prima materia, according to the path I believe the Coronatio Naturae to be representing. And what I find interesting here, and we'll explore this further as we progress, is, I don't know how clear it is on your screens, but you can kind of see this star-like appearance in the matter in the left, which is quite interesting. In some other paths, such as the star of Regulus or Regulus of Antimony, for those familiar with Basil Valentine, they talk about this star representing the Star of Bethlehem. And it really is the first thing that the alchemist sees to alert him that, so it's kind of like a marker in the sand or in the sky or in the vessel to show that we're on the right path. It is that guiding star which signals the way, which then the Magi will have to attend to. If we move to the next emblem, please. Thank you, Frater Rob. So here we have emblem 2. And it's quite obvious to see there's kind of a clear division between that which is above and that which is below. And it's really interesting for me when we look at this, and I see it as the crude matter, which isn't obvious. But the crude matter essentially embodies all of the above in the below. We see the sun and moon in the bottom part, and you see there's a bar connecting them. They're conjoined, they're one thing at this stage, which kind of lets us know that this matter, our matter, has within it both polarities, the masculine, the feminine. What's also interesting is when you look at the landscape of the manuscripts, you see them called various things. So in some manuscript, it's called the Subjectum Chemicum, or the Radix Artis, or Saturnus Mercurius. Rob, would you like to go to the next screen? Sorry, this would be much smoother in that control. And we can see here, when we put them side by side, we can start to look at the various manuscripts as providing us with insight or a clue into what is this crude matter. So Subjectum Chemicum, the chemical subject, okay, the subject of our art. Radix Artis, the root of our art, which is extremely interesting. And then it alludes to Saturn and Mercurius. If it's the what we're going to look at next on the next slide is we're going to focus in on 2 of these components. If you just scroll down. And we're going to look at these. So we have the Subjectum Chemicum and Saturnus. So those who may be familiar with the planetary correspondences to the metals, we all know that Saturn relates to lead. And Frater Rob mentioned earlier on about the importance that Saturn holds in that first emblem. And it's this that really triggered my interest, because we, commonly when we speak of alchemy, people will always know and talk about the idea of turning lead into gold. And whether we believe it or not is somewhat irrelevant, because it is the alchemical process, be it practical or psychological, that it's a journey, and we're going through it ourselves indeed. But I do want to delve into this idea that it is lead, because I do believe it's an operative tradition that's been depicted. So let's look at lead in a bit more detail. So if we go to the next slide, what we see here is lead if we pulled it out of the ground or the mine. It's called galena, and it's the lead sulfide. For some of the more esoteric or hermetic masons, particularly those perhaps in France or Italy of the Egyptian rites, saw the blazing star with the G in the middle, and they speculated that it alludes to the name of the crude matter. Whether this is true or not, of course, it's just one perspective for those who are alchemically minded. But it is very interesting, and it does form part of catechisms and some more alchemical rites. What I found interesting, yeah, that's fine, you can move down to the next one, is when I was delving into the mysteries of Saturn on a Saturday, I sort of come across this quote from Jakob Burma. And as you see, he said, "For you see, this gold is locked inside Saturn." And we know it, or I know it from the internal practices of the Coronatio traditions, who broke down the hermetic bodies into four, starting with the Saturnian body representing the physical, densest part, and moving into more subtle bodies. But in the operative alchemical tradition, I didn't quite grasp the esoteric nature of lead. Of course, as we mentioned, it's the furthest planet, it's the parent of shall we say, of all of the planets. But one of the things within this tradition is it hinted at, and if we look at Thomas Norton, and he talks about the lineage of this particular tradition, or the acetate path tradition, and he points towards Gabir or Jabir. And if we move to the next slide, we'll start to explore this esoteric nature, which I just find really, really fascinating. And for those who be familiar, Gabir or Jabir, al-Sufi, the Sufi, he was a phenomenal character, but he did a bit of work called The Theory of Balances, and it's something that I must find a decent English translation of. It's a vast text, but one of the things that it highlights is that what they were doing, the Sufis, or the alchemical Sufis, what they were doing is they saw that the numerical values were given to the four Aristotelian qualities of hot, cold, dry, and moist. And these qualities were then ascribed to each letter of the Arabic alphabet. And in this way, through observing the names of substances, they'll be able to examine the complexion and their esoteric qualities. And I'll bring this to life now with the next slide. So Gabir had said that he couldn't detect a difference between lead and gold, for each contains 17 parts or portions of certain qualities. Now we look here on the screen, you'll see the Arabic word rasas, forgive my pronunciation, which means lead, and the hub, which means gold. So what they would do is they would look at each of these letters, the Arabic letters, and they would work out from that what its qualities are, okay? So, and they would say it has an external quality and an internal quality. And straight away, we can see this interrelationship between lead and gold. For lead in its outer qualities is 3 parts coldness. Gold in its outer qualities is 3 parts heat. It's by opposite. Then lead is 8 parts dryness. Gold is 8 parts humid. lead in its inner qualities is 1 part heat, whereas gold is 1 part coldness, and then 5 parts humidity on the inside of lead, and then 5 parts dryness in gold, both composed of 17 parts or portions. And this was, for me, it kind of signifies why this is such an important starting material, because there's various traditions that hold it in high esteem. And indeed, through this observation, Gebir wasn't able to notice any difference. I think it was Sendivogius, in fact, who said that gold and lead contained the same seed. And the Arabic alchemists, what they would do is they would be able to manipulate these proportions, and that's what they would do in the alchemical work, resulting in a transmutation of the metal. So if we move on to the next slide. So now we just look at this quote again for Berman when he says, "For you see, this gold is locked inside Saturn." Basing it on the Arabic tradition of alchemy, we can see how this really is true, in an esoteric sense at least. Whether modern chemists believe this or not is another conversation. But for us, it's extremely important. And something else that I noticed on this particular emblem that I would like to discuss, if you just scroll down to the next slide, is this word here, which we see across the emblems, doesn't feature in all of them, but in most of them. And it's the word Malachi, which in Hebrew is spelled Mem, Lamed, Aleph, Kaf. Again, forgive my Hebrew. And Malak or Malachi means angel or the messenger. And for me, this is the second emblem in, and it's the first time we see the mention of any form of hierarchy. And it's really the beginning. You can see here is why it's the beginning of the work. It's the first mention of that. If we move to the next slide, Frater Rob, what's also interesting, in some of the texts that accompany it and text relating to this path, there's a slight misspelling. The question is that intentional or is it a mistake? For some people have spelt it Mem, Lamed, Het, as opposed to Mem, Lamed, Aleph, Kaf. Malek, that then means salt, which is extremely interesting. And we can see the drops that descend, and some will say that these might depict dew, the fiery salt, because it's not so much the liquid, it's the salt that is contained within these droplets of dew that is really so key to our Rosicrucian tradition. So it's very interesting, this idea of Malachi, Malek, the angel, salt. But if we go back to the root word or the root letters of these words, particularly of Malachi, of Mem, Lamed, Kaf, we have the word king. And I'll leave that for your own considerations. So it's extremely interesting now. So we move on to the next slide, please, Frater. So to sum it up, you see by looking at the various manuscripts, we can start to be informed as to what this is representing. And the radix artist, the root of the art, is then the salt of Saturn. And those who are familiar with some of the alchemical past, this salt of Saturn is none other than lead acetate in common language. And it's particularly important, I think it was Pythagoras who said salt is born of the purest parents, the sun and the sea. And we see in this emblem the depiction of the sea. Now this sea isn't this, or perhaps it is the sea that we're all familiar with, but there's also the idea of the Hermetic sea. And if we move into the next emblem, we have to ask the question of how we move from this galena to reverse engineer it to our prima materia. And if we go to the next slide, please, Rob. So this brings us on to emblem 3, preparatio, or preparation. And if we scroll down, we're going to start to understand and explore how do we reverse engineer back this crude matter. And I think this is extremely important because it's somewhat rare. In alchemical texts and emblems, they will show you the philosophical work once you've created your prima materia, but it's somewhat rare that they actually show you how to prepare it. Samuel Norton does an excellent job of this in his manuscript. He was the grandson of Thomas Norton, a contemporary, very likely a close companion of George Ripley. But what's interesting here is you see, again, the sun and moon still joined together in one substance, but they're somewhat submerged in this kind of green solution. Rob, if you'd like to move to the next slide. So this particular way that the crude matter was prepared is kind of where it gets its name via humida, or the wet wave, which Frater Rob mentioned. Whereby we create this solution. If we move to the next slides, this is where it's going to get tricky. We see this journey from the crude matter, emblem 1, then the solution to get to our prima material, which is kind of what I'm going to depict to you now on the next slide and the following. So first of all, we need to question what, and this isn't spoken of in the emblems themselves, but it's alluded to in some parts. What is the first solvent that we take in hand? And most people will look at this and think it's wine, and we distill it to get an alcohol. But those of you that be familiar with the acetate path and the work of Ripley, Samuel Norton, Thomas Norton, and some of the earlier adepts will know that this is red wine vinegar, which we then distill to get our essentially acetic acid. And we move down to the next image. And what we would do here is we would essentially crumble down our crude matter, and we would then roast that matter or calcine it until it became a red lead oxide, which the ancients called zarquin, which was kind of it was taken from an Arabic word which they used for lead oxide. And what you see on the right hand side, disclaimer, this is technical grade. Whilst I'm still practicing at this early stage, I've not crumbled down my galena just yet, and I'm practicing with that. But essentially it won't look quite as red as that because it's extremely pure, but essentially you will get the same thing. So we scroll down to the next slide, please. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our lead oxide or our minium, and then we're going to pour our solution on top of it. If you just move to the next slide, please. So here you can see side by side the emblem, and then what happens when we pour our solvent onto our lead. Okay, and you'll see the similarity in the color. And I don't know how clear it is for you all, but not all of the lead will dissolve, which is quite interesting. Some of it will dissolve into the acetic acid, but not all of it. And if we move on to the next slide, what we see is side by side is we're going to take that solution and we're going to filter it to remove as much as those kind of raw lead compounds as possible. And what you see on the right hand side is, or was known as, the terra damnata, or the damned earth. And it's this part of the lead which does not make it into our philosophic work. Okay, we scroll to the next slide. So here we move on to the fourth emblem, and I'll touch on it fairly quickly because we've got lots more to cover. But essentially what we have here is the solution once it's been filtered, and we'll filter it 3 times. And then in this divisio, we're going to apply heat, and we're going to start to remove some of this liquid, and we're going to start to congeal it down. And if we move to the next slide, and we say one of the key figures in this tradition is George Ripley. And Ripley said at this point, at the stage of the work, which is helping us to inform us, is then put all of these cold liquors, thus filled, into a thick glass vessel and set in a balneo marie to evaporate in the temperate heat, which done, our sericon will be coagulated into a green gum called our green lion, which gum dry well, yet beware thou burn not his flowers, nor destroy his greenness. So we move to the next emblem. What we see here as we start to place it under a heat is we see these crystals starting to form, or this salt, which is lead acetate, to speak plainly. But what's interesting, what Ripley's referring to there of be careful not to burn these flowers, it's these crystals or this crystallization, which in the mineral kingdom, they refer to as flowers. So just as we have flowers in the vegetable kingdom, these are the flowers of the mineral kingdom. And if we scroll down to the next slide, and essentially, once we continue to evaporate this off, being careful not to burn our flowers, it will reduce down into what Ripley called the gamocericon, or green lion. Noting here that I used a technical grade, so obviously the color is slightly different. Had I used galena, because of its impurities, we would have got a green product, which I've seen from another much more experienced practitioner. But this is essentially how we create our prima materia and the first 4 steps. If you'd like to scroll through, you might want to go through the first ones briefly, and then here's where we are, and here's the work that we've done so far. And this is interesting because up to this point, I've said many times, there's the beginning of the philosophical work or the work. The preparation wasn't treated as a philosophical work. It was kind of, that's the beginning. Reducing it down to its prima materia was reducing it back to its God-given form in the beginning, might we say. And if we move to the next slide, something that's extremely important within this tradition, and we're touching this in a few different, the emblems, is we mentioned it's called the via humida, or commonly known as the wet way. And that's mainly because of what you've just seen and the way we prepare the crude matter through a solution, through a wet menstruum. However, at the heart of this tradition is pyrolysis, and the idea of being essentially mastering fire, because it holds many of the keys that we need to understand. And it's something that's greatly misunderstood today in some of the more modern alchemical schools who have taken more of a chemical lens. We move to the next slide. So this is a catechism, which I'll just read out because it's extremely important. How many philosophical fires are there? There are 3 types, which are the natural, the unnatural, and the contranatural. Explain to me these 3 types of fire. The natural fire is the masculine fire, or the principal agent. The unnatural fire is the feminine, or the dissolvent of nature, nourishing and taking the form of white smoke, which quickly vanishes when it's under this form. If one does not take care, and it is almost incomprehensible, through the philosophical sublimation, it becomes corporeal and resplendent. The contranatural fire is that which corrupts the compound and has the power to unbind what has been strongly bound by nature. And if we move to the next slide, this idea of the different philosophical fires is extremely important in the great work. And particularly when we discuss Raymond Lull, has come up many times already today, you'll see is a key figure in this tradition. He was particularly made a strong point about these different fires. And in the emblems, we see 2 of these fires depicted. Here, you can see 2 variations of the green lion. And this green lion is our starting matter. And it is the natural fire. It is the masculine principle, which we would then dry distill to get our elements. And the next fire that we see in the emblems feature is the ignis in naturalis, which we'll see in the next slide. And this alludes to that unnatural fire, or the feminine fire. And it's quite interesting here because the ignis in naturalis is one of the things that the alchemists failed and it's a huge key into how we go back into our matter later on, when we're looking to extract a very specific substance or salt. And it is probably the most elusive things, and we see this in the way they say that it appears as a white fume, and it quickly vanishes. And this, in the alchemical tradition, was known as the element of air once it's been rectified. And it is the famous water which does not wet hands. But once it's been rectified, it will evaporate at body temperature. So literally, if you was to put it on your hand, it's pure acetone to speak plainly, you would not feel it, because your body temperature would boil it. So you can start to understand why they said this is the water which does not wet hands. So in this particular manuscript, in the Crowning of Nature, we see the use of two fires, the natural fire and the unnatural fire, which leaves the contra-natural fire, or the fire against nature, as it's commonly called. I think this is extremely important for us. Rob, if you just move to the next slide. Around the time of Lull and some of the others that followed, they saw there was two works, the lesser work and the greater work. And I found this particularly interesting, that the idea of the transmutation of base metals into gold was actually seen as the lesser work. Whereas I think most of us would assume that the creation of a stone that can transmute metals is the creme de la. However, that's not the case. The greater work was actually, the attention was paid to the creation of the universal medicine. And it's this reason which particularly interests me in a practical alchemical tradition. And it said there's arguments about whether Lull was who he was. Was he an alchemist? Some say that his loved one fell ill, and it's in search of a cure or the universal medicine. That's when his alchemical quest began, which is quite interesting. But this idea of the lesser work and the greater work isn't openly spoken about nowadays, because, or for whatever reason. If we move on to the next slide, just a quote from Raymond Lull, just to highlight his position. So he says, "It would be safer for a man to eat the eyes of a basilisk than gold made with our fire against nature." And just to clarify here, so the fire against nature is, or the contra to nature, is essentially mineral acids. So nowadays, if we used to go online and search for potable gold, we'll probably find quite a few people selling it. And you go on YouTube and you watch videos, and generally people are using corrosive acids to dissolve the gold to extract its oil. Those corrosive acids or mineral acids are the fire against nature, and they don't hold place in the tradition. And I think this is extremely important, because what it boils down to is why isn't it used? And essentially at speed. It's much easier to use a corrosive acid, but like it mentioned in the catechism, it corrupts the compound. And it said that oils produced with the fire against nature, one, we shouldn't be ingesting them. People talk about sweetening them in various ways, but like Lowell said, it's not safe to do so. So this is extremely important, and we'll kind of come to it because this is really the heart of the tradition for me, especially in the Lullian Ripleyan tradition, which I feel is depicted in this particular set of emblems. We move on to the next emblem. So we mentioned a few times this idea of pyrolysis, which comes from two words, pyro, fire, and lysis, dissolution. And what we're going to do is take our prima materia, or our green lion, and we're going to apply heat to it. And essentially, if we move to the next slide, is we're going to separate the elements. And this was another interesting aspect of the emblems, because in more common alchemical traditions, and texts, we hear a lot about the three principles of salt, sulfur, and mercury. However, we don't hear so much about the four elements and the role they play. And in the Coronatio Naturae, the elements, or the separation of the elements, take up 16 emblems across the whole piece. So there's a clear importance about the four elements. I would love to go through all of these, and I would probably take another 2-3 hours. So I'm gonna just go through it quickly. But essentially, what you're seeing here is the separation and the rectification of the elements. And the reason this is important, because essentially we're creating a quintessence. That's what we're working towards. And it's through this interplay of the elements that they wash each other in a way, and we use them to rectify each other. And that's why you see some depicting 2 layers, some 4 layers, and things like that. But essentially the key here is, in this sequence, we will produce 2 more solvents. One being the alkahest, which many of you may have come across as something that's a very guarded secret in alchemical art. And I showed earlier the ignis naturalis, which is one of the ways we extract something that we need to produce our alkahest, but also how do we recombine these elements back together. So Robbie, if we move on to the next slide, this isn't going to work. This is a shame. So this was a video, and what you would have seen is this white fume going up into the still head, and that white fume was the ignis naturalis that we mentioned, but that we heard of in the catechism, the white smoke in its crude form. And this is known as our white mercury. And what you can see in this image, you start to see the red drops, or the oil starting to come over, which is the element of fire. If we scroll down to the next one, here we slightly closer into the condenser, and you'll see the white fume, and you'll see this oil starting to form. So here we have our elements of air and fire, and there's water, and there's actually earth in there too, but they're very subtle at this stage. But we saw earlier on in the earlier emblems of the sun and moon being conjoined and being together. So through this dry distillation, destructive distillation, or pyrolysis of our prima materia, we're starting to separate the sun and moon, and we see them come over at different stages. And it's this red and white fume, as it was depicted in, say, the Rosarium, and is essentially the red and white mercury. And we know some people say that the salt, sulfur, and mercury, but in the tradition, some people call it the mercurius duplicatus. In the ancient accepted Scottish rite, I'm sure all of us at some point would have seen the double-headed eagle. And this is alluding to, alchemically, this what you see in front of you. The idea that the eagle is the volatile principle, the green lion being the fixed, and this being the volatile, and the double-headed being the red and the white fume. If we just move down to the next one, and we see as this progresses later on, the red really starts to come through. And like I say, I've only used a small amount, so it would produce more, but this is just for demonstration purposes. And essentially what we get in our receiving flask is this golden water. And we see this depicted in the emblems as well. Like I said, we haven't given away everything. Unfortunately or fortunately, there's more to come in the future. But it's from this distillate, this golden water, that we separate the 4 elements, which is really key to this tradition. Robbie, we scroll down to the next one. Here we have the elements of air and fire, just alluding to one of the earlier depictions that we saw in the separation, and how they're used to clean each other and rectify each other. Okay, if we move to the next, very good question. So now we've kind of rectified within the emblems, they've gone through this process of preparing the crude matter, making it the prima materia, pyrolysis to it to get the 4 elements, which they've separated, rectified, and now they're recombining them together. And the product of that is the quinta essentia, which we see in the next slide being depicted. And what's really interesting here, I think it's in the next slide, which makes it a bit clearer, is this journey of the prima materia having the 4 elements in their potentia, which I showed in a more modern glyph of the chaos, and then the quintessence being, or is, our philosophical Mercury. It is the Mercury of the philosophers, for it is the 4 elements rectified and recombined into the 5th essence or quintessence, which by the early Franciscans, of which Lowell was one of them, if we look at John of Rupacissa, excuse my pronunciation, would see this representing the resurrected body of Christ, the perfection, the 4 elements perfected. And we see the pelican in the middle here. And I think this is interesting because we see this idea of the prima materia represent the 4 elements, and essentially it is a polarity. So at one end of the scale, we have the 4 elements in one condition, and then at the other end of the scale, we have them in one condition, but in their perfected form. And in the next slide, we just see, which is quite interesting, and we won't have time to go through it today, is just there's various depictions of this quinta essentia in the work, because later on we'll multiply it and things like that. What you see on the right-hand side is the beginning of the fixation. And it's worth pointing out here that this substance is extremely important, because we know that to create the universal medicine, one of the things that we can do is dissolve gold to extract a ferment from it, which is extremely important. And where I said before, some people will use the fire against nature, whereas we will use our quinta essentia, our Mercury of the philosophers, which will do that. And what we see here depicted, and it will lead to the fixation of the stone. If we scroll down to the next slide, and Frater Rob mentioned here, some emblems end at 40, which was the white stone commonly, and it is interesting. I'm not there yet, so I can't speak on too much about this, to be honest with you. But what Ripley speaks of is at this stage, when you've created your white stone, you would divide it into 2, and you would use some of it to perform a transmutation of silver in order to extract a ferment from the silver. And with the other half, you do more things, which we won't go into here. But essentially, if we didn't do a projection and we just continue to let it digest, it would eventually become the red stone. And we do see this depicted in one of the manuscripts. But it is interesting because that manuscript alludes to the higher angelic hierarchies as well, but it hasn't got the multiplication stage, and it's much lower in the hierarchy, which is quite interesting. So this multiplication of the quintessence accelerates its journey into the higher angelic realms. So we scroll down, you might actually have it, yeah, you do. So there is that one of them that ends at 40, but it depicts the red stone there. And then the next slide that it would have would be of the projection of that. So I'm conscious of how long I've been talking for. But this was one of the slides which, or the emblems, which really struck a chord with both myself and Frater Rob, and the idea of the potential, and it opens up a lot of questions. But what I really just wanted to touch on was we talked about the kind of the hierarchies. We haven't gone into the detail. We won't have time to do it. But that was my biggest realization. And I think Martin, you kind of mentioned about this idea of what would Raymond Lull have done. And I think we mentioned at the beginning, for us, alchemy is a holy art. And I think we should regard it as such. It's very easy to profane it with chemical language. And there's much talk nowadays of internal and external forms of alchemy, which are brilliant. We need more of that. But I have to say, one of the biggest realizations I've had since doing the practical work is that inner outer layer veil disappears. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing the work because, I think if it does what it says on the tin or on the emblems, it will be extremely exciting and hopefully the benefit for all humanity. I'll finally add, like in the fixation of the stone, it was called the cherubim, and we saw it in some of the emblems Frater Rob showed of handling the crown over to then this chap here. And my question is then, it's not said in the manuscripts, but is this the seraphim, that which is closest to God, which I find interesting, particularly because the work is called the Opus Angelorum, the work of the angels. And the word seraphim, the root word in Hebrew, has the same root letters as the word for resin. And if you look that up in the Hebrew dictionary, what that's alluding to is manna, and manna being the food of angels, which is extremely interesting. And I've got lots of pondering to do upon that. But the idea of the stone is the food of the angels. I've spoken. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you, Rob and Alistair. That was an extraordinary and epic presentation and absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much. That was obviously a great deal of work has gone into this, and wonderful collaboration between you both. So I would like to open up to questions from our attendees. So it would help me if people raise their hands. This is already happening, I can see. So I'm just going to take a look at whose hands are raised currently. Firstly, we have Alex. It's lovely to see you, Alex. Over to you.
Yes, hi. Yes, see you again. So this method of putting aside the philosophical side, okay, but this physical method of alchemy using heat to get to the essence of the metal and eventually the quintessence, okay, fine. That was done in the 16, 17, 1800s when the technology was what it was. Today, we have a different technology. And my question is, when we use our technology to release the energy of the atom, which is really what you're doing in alchemy, isn't that the same thing? Putting philosophy aside. So when we break up the atom and we release the electrons and the energy flows, we have nuclear fusion, fission energy. Isn't that the same thing as breaking up the atom using the alchemical method? Putting philosophy aside.
Sure, it's a great question, and it reminds me of the line of thought of Falconelli and Schwaller de Lubitsch and what those guys were doing and the way that they saw the work. I'll be quite honest. For me, I'm not a chemist. I didn't really pay much attention in school. I'm somewhat illiterate, so forgive me. Fundamentally, is it the same thing? Yes. But again, for me, and I reiterate this, I think it's the holy aspects. And I think that alchemy is one of those things, and I don't know if you practice it. And when you do it, something just changes. It's like you go back in time. And I have this inquisitive mind. I want to know, I want to search. What does it represent, in modern language and things like that? But once you start doing the work, it's like you go back in time. It's your whole state changes, your very matter changes, and you start to go through those processes. And whilst they do, open up answers to these kind of questions, for me, it's an experiential thing. And I feel like if it was kind of to talk about it in a strictly chemical sense, or, you know, as you put it, we're somewhat losing the essence of it in a way. But at the same time, I'm also very interested down the line. What happens when we create the stone, and what does that represent? You know, when we run it through analysis and things like that, what is it? Can it help humanity? Which I think fundamentally is the most important thing in the exploration, is how is it relevant today to solve some of the world's issues? In my day job, I work with various technology companies and innovators, and a lot of them are kind of, they're actually doing pyrolysis in sustainability, where they take waste matter and they apply it to heat and they distill it off, and then they use the components to create fuel. And there's a few companies I've met, and I've just said to them, what happens if you've done that once? What if you take that distillate and then put it back and do it again, and then mix them up? And we do this whole separating of the elements thing. What potential might it unlock? So whilst I don't want to sound ignorant and say ignore the scientific side, focus on the holy side, essentially the lines blur, right? So I'm very interested in the practical applications, especially around sustainability. Sorry, that's a bit long-winded.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to pass you over to Kristen now. Over to you, Kristen.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I just wondered if these manuscripts are in publication. I had bought this. Oh, wait a minute. Wait. There we go. Okay. I had bought this lovely large publication of the Rosicrucian lessons. It's in German, but I bought this edition because the wonderful images are in color. And then I also bought the English edition, which is black and white. Would those images be in this book? Do you know?
The answer is no, they're not. I have that same book, and in fact, Cindy, who's on this call, is the one who told me to buy that book quickly before it got sold out. It was an absolute gem.
Right.
One of the best publications of the Geheime Figuren that exists. There are quite a lot of archival grade digital scans of manuscripts. Obviously, we've seen the ones in the British Isles that we were able to visit, and we have plans to see some in Amsterdam and other things in person, Italy. But there's a number of manuscripts that have been scanned online that you can find. Adam McLean's website, the Alchemy website, I'm sure every single person here has been across that at some stage. On his page about the crowning of nature, it might be slightly buried from an obvious link, but he has collated, I believe, 6 different digitized versions of these different manuscripts around the world. Since his publication in the 1980s, there hasn't been a book one. All I can say is watch this space. But there are digital versions of scans, and they're high quality. So you can get them from various libraries and archives online.
But not in publication.
No, well, the one you can get in publication is the Barchusen emblems. So the ones in black and white printed from 1718. If you know, there's that very famous book, I'm sure many of us have it. It's called Alchemy and Mysticism by Taskin. It's a very, very thick book of all the color illustrations they could get from the Hermetic tradition and put into one book, basically. It is fantastic, and probably one of the best values in an esoteric bookstore you can buy because of how much stuff it puts in there. But there's a very famous publisher, Taskin, T-A-S-C-H-E-N. Their book, Alchemy and Mysticism, has the full series of the Barchusen, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but his emblems from 1718. They're the black and white emblems, unfortunately. They don't have quite the soul of the hand-drawn ones. But you can get the full series either online or in that text.
Great, thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Over to you, Jack.
thank you, Rob and Alistair, for just an absolutely amazing talk. That was so enlightening, and it's amazing to be able to have someone walk through the emblems with us like that, Alistair. That's an immense service you've done all of us. So from the bottom of my heart, thanks. I have a question about sort of building on what Alex was talking about. And it seems to me one of the things that you were talking about, Alistair, and Rob, you mentioned it as well, is that the most vital thing about this is the holiness of alchemy, and that in the modern science, there is not a holy regard for nature or the forms of nature. And because of that, the earth is being pillaged, and we're in a very, very dangerous position here in our history. So my question is sort of about this fragmentation of alchemy that you were talking about, Rob, and I wonder if both of you could speak to this, that there's sort of the psychological, and then there's the spagyric or Paracelsian, and then there's Burma and the spiritual, and then there's also modern science, chemistry. How are we supposed to approach all of this knowledge that the chemists have accumulated in the last few centuries? Do either of you have any ideas about how we can redivinize science and make it holy in a way to sort of spread this message to materialists who are engaging in practices that are harmful for many people?
Yeah, I can't speak for us, Alistair, and I know he has some views on this as well. There does need to be a kind of recombination of these different separations, which in itself is appropriately alchemical. So the different aspects of it, whether it's the scientific or the mystical or the psychological, have kind of gone on their own journey. Those elements have been separated, they've been purified, and now they need to be brought back together. So that is kind of the mindset that needs to come with this. It can be tricky to do that in the modern world, which is becoming increasingly secular, and particularly in the scientific sphere, although you will find many people like Newton who are practicing a lot of this stuff, they wouldn't dare to bring a sacred context into these kind of explorations, at least not publicly. However, I think there is a root in here which speaks to kind of the core of what's occurring through this process of alchemy, which occurs both in the vessel physically and within the alchemist and within nature, all kind of simultaneously. In that, and we've discussed this in the past, it's about how reality is constructed in the meeting point between nature and consciousness, between the macrocosm and the microcosm. And there is something occurring here, which I think in a modern vernacular, I would like to call technologies of the imagination, I think is maybe a root in, whereby we need to re-sacredize the sense of what the imagination is within our own consciousness. And that then starts to give us a very sacred and humbling view of what's occurring whenever we perceive these processes, trying to understand them, to create narratives around them, whether it, in the many different spiritual, scientific, political, economic contexts. It's all narrative, it's all imagination. Everything is imagination. Everything humanity has ever done is imagination. But it's about creating a sacred sense of that as interfacing with objective reality. And from that, everything else that humanity has ever done emerges. So I think that's the root in, because I think it's a language that people, it's also appropriately enough, and I know Martin and others like to talk a lot about the art of memory, and that's a very Rosicrucian concept as well, hermetic concept. So I think that's part of the role that modern Rosicrucianism has to play to help re-sacredize these kinds of things. And I think alchemy is something that is very tangible, because unlike a lot of the more internal processes that we do, or theurgic processes often, it is requiring you to do something quite precise and material, and it requires you, and I know Alistair talks in better detail about this, so I'll stop soon, but it requires you to have a very, very nuanced relationship with what is going on in front of you. So as someone was mentioning earlier, the old Athenors weren't, you couldn't dial that into a single Celsius point of temperature heat as we kind of can today. So they had to develop an incredibly nuanced, intuitive understanding of heat, of temperature, of what was occurring in the vessel, because as Alistair was mentioning, you know, be careful not to burn your flowers. That can be the matter of a few degrees, right? So that level of focus and concentration on the core of what was occurring in nature, I think unlocks that ecstatic sense that you're connecting with how reality is formed. I hope that kind of makes sense. I think that's where a lot of this is going, and why we are seeing a kind of resurgence in it as people are starting to understand that the desacredized science, it doesn't have a sense of where any of this is going. It doesn't have a sense of where any of the purpose of it is, other than just create, and suddenly you've got an atomic bomb, right? As was mentioned previously. And so there is a need to do it, and have a greater sense of why we would do any of this. And that's why, you know, I've personally found the very, very early stages of alchemy so fulfilling, because you immediately start to understand, once you start physically doing it, the experience that was occurring between the alchemist and the vessel.
Thank you.
And I'll hand over to Frater Alistair for more thoughts on that process.
I'll keep it brief, because you kind of touched on loads of things that are just super valuable. I always love hearing what you've got to say. I think we see in the world there's a whole heap of solve, right? This separation in we just need to go online or go outside, and we see it. And I think the world just needs more coagula. And I think it's our duty to be the mediums in that. And I find it like this dualistic, I won't say battle, because I don't think we should see it as a battle, but that reunification with of the opposites. And I think that's what alchemy represents for me, is this idea that this separating of the elements you mentioned, but it's this rectification. Like in alchemy, you don't ignore that which is not pure. That's the key to the work. You go back with something that's pure, maybe an ideal that you have, maybe a philosophy, maybe something that represents purity, and then you take that thing and then you go back and visit that which is regarded as filth, which most people would ignore. And I think it's that spirit for me. It's like alchemy gives me hope, because imagine you was in that vessel and you was being tormented by heat and being pulled apart and separated, but then you're put back together and resurrected, and suddenly you become the pelican. And you know, Rob and I have talked about this at length, this idea of the rose and the pelican, which kind of is a play on a little, just on our exploration. And the rose being that first stage, that awakening, the blossoming of our stone, or the white stone, maybe that state of samadhi or realization, but then the continuation of the work being the reddening and becoming the pelican. And I think it's, you know, for me, this relationship between maybe the profane and the sacred. You know, I was probably the worst for it a few years ago. You know, I got really deep into my practices, and then I was just kind of felt really uncomfortable. But then actually, it was then when I turned to alchemy that helped me to kind of solve some of those perhaps internal imbalances. As for like science's position, I think there's much to be gained. Like alchemy, it's regarded as the royal art, and I find it fascinating. If we look at it psychologically, as our soul is the athanor, or whether we're using physical matter, it's universal. And that's what I think the strength in alchemy is. I can talk about alchemy to a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a pagan, or an atheist. It can't be disputed, because it is the law that we've been given. That is the law of nature. It's eternal. And I think it's, how do we awaken the hearts of humanity to listen to the voice of nature, and then how do we observe her, as we do through alchemy, to be informed about what we can do to solve the state of the world, and particularly, you know, planetary issues. Like Frater Rob mentioned a couple of authors, Jennifer Ramplin, I think it was, and Lawrence Principe, and they're doing a great series of books, and I'll definitely ask everybody to look at them up. Of kind of like this, they're scientists, they're academics, but they're not turning their nose up at alchemy. They're looking at it with an honest heart. And I think for me, we're at this interesting time when thought leaders in that sense are starting to look at the ancient ways and realize that there is value. I'm a man of faith, so I believe that, the light will come forth. It's just we need people to open the doors. The art is, how do we open the doors? We're not necessarily telling people to walk through it. All we have to do is create the right environment, and hopefully the hierarchies will do the work.
Thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree with what both Rob and Alistair just said, and I'd just like to make a comment, please. I think that there's a danger in approaching this subject matter, and that danger is in over-intellectualizing the process, it being an intellectual pursuit, rather than something which naturally nurtures our capacity to empathize with the spiritual essence of nature, and in all its different forms and realms. You mentioned if you like, the sacredization, I think you mentioned there, Rob, of our consciousness, our awareness of the sacred in everything. I think that this is potentially the great unifier, because it's unfortunate that we've lost our connection with the sacred aspects of the natural world. All indigenous people have had a reverence and a respect for the individual expressions of spirit in all its different forms in the plant kingdom, in the animal kingdom, and so on. And I feel very strongly that the way that we as a species can redeem things, the only real way is by consciously reconnecting with the sacred spirit of everything living. I welcome any of your thoughts on that.
Well, my immediate thought would be here, quite frankly. So,
sorry, Rod, could you say that again, please? I didn't catch that.
My immediate thought would be here. I agree, and that's the journey that modern Rosicrucianism is trying to go on. I think this is we have discussed this quite a bit over the last few years in this study group. Is how do we take the idea of curing the sick and that gratis into the modern world? We're not all becoming doctors who walk the streets, assisting people in a medicinal sense. We need to assist people in reconnecting with that spiritual energy and perception that enables them to see what they're doing in light of a bigger purpose than just pure self-interest. And so I think that's a huge part that collectively we as Rosicrucians in all of our different spheres and avenues are here to achieve. And then the question is, how do we ourselves get to that point? And that's where we start talking about all these different paths. And then that's the difference, what Frater Alistair was saying. Your path will take you to the white stone, but then what you do with that will take you to the red stone.
Thank you very much, Rob. I'd like to hand over now, please. We have a few hands up. Hasu, over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rob, Alistair. Fascinating the way you sort of put things together, made it interesting to see where you come from. Now, a number of things that I've scribbled on a bit of paper so I don't forget. H means memory fades, rather than fading quickly. Put it down on paper. But the first thing, Alistair, you mentioned the word rasa. Now, it's very interesting the word rasas, and that you allocated that word to the Arabs. In fact, if you go back into history and look at the Vedas, there's a word called rasa shastra, which is the whole process of creating what we talk of today as alchemy. So it goes back further into, and the other thing is interesting because also the Shastras and the Sutras were integral parts of the Vedas. They were not separated. Whereas, today, if you look at the sort of, and Alistair, you mentioned talking to the Muslims, the Jews, the Christians. You forgot that you never spoke to those who practiced Hinduism or the Vedas. Because to us, this is an integral part of knowing nature and nature that exists around you and how you can use nature to sustain humanity. So it is using the natural elements, natural products that make us what we are. But also, there are words, if I've got a booklet if you want, and if you leave me an email address or something, I'll forward it to you. It's all the rasas, and each metal being differently, how each metal is differently processed through each of its stages. And this is from the Rasa Shastra. So it may add to your understanding and maybe add to your processing. But the other thing I also found very interesting, you mentioned the word water that does not wet hands. And, in alchemy, one thing that everyone forgets, it's not the lead. I think it's mercury that is much more of the element that is thought of as so unique, a metal that's liquid, which does not stick anyway. It rolls. It could be mercury rather than what we think that it may refer to. So maybe we're sort of the lead, the mercury elements are getting a bit. Now, I was also thinking about sacred context of what you spoke about, and what you spoke about is very much of the idea that to understand the sacred, first of all, you must understand yourself, and then you can understand the sacred, and then you can understand nature. Because unless you have that combination, in my personal opinion and my personal way of thinking, you miss out. So it's like a puzzle, a three-part, only a three-part puzzle, but the most complex puzzle you can ever put together. But again, I think Rob, Alistair, you have opened a really, really big subject and a big topic which we must all think about and try to understand. But I appreciate, thank you very much. I won't ask any questions because I'm not that knowledgeable in the alchemical world, but from what you spoke and what you said is fascinating and interesting, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassan. When you mentioned about the rasa, when I first stumbled across the Kabir work talking about the lead and the gold and the inner and outer qualities, and I saw the word rasa, straight away I thought of the yogic tradition. My entry into my spiritual path was through the yogic tradition, so and my alchemical journey, to be honest. So yeah, it's that was very interesting, and obviously I think with this particular topic, alchemy covers, like we said, it's universal. It's got so many different garments that it can wear, and yeah, the rasa tradition is extremely interesting, and one that I'm talking to a friend at the moment and potentially exploring it and things like that. Just it's not quite so straightforward here. But I think what I also found very interesting with the yogic connection, and of course, for me, it kind of, I don't want to get into it too much, but it predates a lot of these things, along with the Sumerian tradition as well, where we see hints at this particular idea of separating things through fire. But in the Ayurvedic tradition, that idea of the medicine and the way that we treat people, understanding the humors, it's all there, and I found that particularly enlightening. I will touch on the mercury part because, of course, it's extremely important in the rasa tradition when we're creating. They see mercury as the sperm of Shiva, and we know that they use it to create lingams. I've seen it happen when I've been in India. But I think there's a distinction here, and I did touch upon it, but I know it was quite fast, is the idea of these different fires, of the natural fires that we use. And we see it in the Rasta tradition, we see it beautifully, because the way they purify the mercury is all through natural substances, which is absolutely amazing. Using vinegar and different things, and lemon and different herbs. It's absolutely incredible. But the idea of the mercury in the Western alchemical tradition, because in order to extract or to fix the mercury, and even in some yogic traditions, you still need a corrosive acid to do that, to fix it. And I'm not saying, I'm not ruling it out as a path. My particular sway is of the Lullian tradition, so that's kind of where my heart speaks from. But this idea, again, is very important, I think, of understanding the corrosive nature. And if we're using, and I think that actually the yogic tradition does it really well, because if we're creating a lingam, an energy form whereby practitioners can go to and they can absorb the energy of that, and that will transmute them, in a sense, that performs the projection on them, which is quite interesting. It's a topic that perhaps we're crossing another day, but yeah, it is interesting. But there's quite distinct differences between the East and West practices, but fundamentally they're all exactly the same, right down to the dowries. And in the Siddha tradition, in the Siddha medicine, you have the idea of making yourself as small as an atom or as big as the world, and you can move from one place to another and appear. And actually, in the Western tradition, in the 1200s, you had the same idea that you would get 4 dowries, 4 gifts when you create that quintessence and you ingest it, that you would do exactly the same as what the yogic tradition says, which is, I found extremely interesting in my research as well. So they are very similar fundamentally. That's why alchemy for me is it's the royal art. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hasu. Over to you, Martin, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, you've given me something else to mention to start with. I just wanted to, we've just been talking about the yogic tradition and the how close it is to the Western tradition there. Alistair, I'd just like to add that if you read some of Thomas Vaughan's writing, you'll find that they were practicing what we'd see as early yogic exercises in the sense of breathing, and they had the same kind of Inga and Pingala going on. It's quite encoded, but not enough that someone who knows the sort of Amrit Siddha or someone wouldn't say, wow, that's it. It's quite amazing. Wow, that's it. Actual breath control being done by Western alchemists. But that wasn't what I was putting my hand up about. Recently, I stumbled across some 17th century Rosicrucian manuals for healing, for actual healing. So they're things like their therapies, their herbalism, they're that kind of stuff. And what I discovered in there was rather beautiful, in the sense that everyone here knows that the Rosicrucians should be learning from 2 books, the Bible and the Book of Nature. But I discovered in there what they thought you should be doing to learn from the Book of Nature, not implied, but spelt out. And they're sitting in nature, contemplating what's going on. They're looking at plants, and some of it is interpretation. Some of it is saying, well, I know this plant's going to be good for my eyes because it does look like an eye, and that's been put in place by divinity to tell me. But a lot of it's more resonance-based. It's kind of, I know this is connected with this and connected with that. But then you start to get some of the things that you read, and you could be mistaken for thinking you're hearing Shane and Alex having a talk one evening, after one of our times together. They're talking about respect for nature and living in harmony. And even in some of them, you kind of get the impression they're moving towards being vegetarian. They're others definitely not. Others you can even see, they're giving you a carnivore diet for a few months, but it's definitely going that way. And isn't it wonderful when you get some of these things where you've got ideas and you learn, yes, it's not that you've thought of them new. You were in tune with what they're trying to say. And they were meeting outdoors quite often and sitting there thinking about how the wind's moving and how the water's flowing and what this plant means and how the animals interact and everything. How lovely this is. But the point I was trying to make is, if this is the beginning point, if you are a part of a tradition that's used to this watching very carefully, thinking about how the seed grows, thinking about how the rain falls, you start to get the feel of the instructions for the alchemist that are not in there. Yeah. No one puts what we think everyone knows in your instruction manuals. So there's no school books that say all the children should be sitting in chairs with something appropriate to write on facing the teacher. I suspect in the alchemy manuals, there's nothing saying you need to have a heightened sense of contemplative awareness towards everything you're doing. And we're only lucky to see these in these Rosicrucian manuals because they're getting a bit overexcited. They're so full of joy. Anyway, I just wanted to share that. And, it shows we're all going in the right direction here.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for that, for the pointer and Thomas Vaughan. I have to ping me an email with the particular book. I do find it interesting, and I have to say, my years of experience with pranayama has served me well, because when you do the practical work, there's certainly things you do not want to be inhaling, and you can be outside. So I do feel like any form of breathing work or some kind of the strength in your lungs is extremely important, and we should be wearing masks and practicing safely. But pranayama is a great a great tool.
And over to Alex.
Dean, you're on mute. A wonderful and fantastic presentation with both of you. I had this personal experience. I wouldn't say I'm in any way an expert on alchemy, and I'm quite interested in how, as I said, the practical aspect of the physical exterior affects the interior, and how you felt internal changes along the way. And one of the images that the last image, it looks like the perfected heart and the king, and the rays of love being extended to all of the individuals in the circle. I had the most bizarre experience about 8 years ago in the Peruvian Amazon. And I'd gone to do I went on an ayahuasca retreat with some Shipibo shaman, and I was there for 8 ceremonies. And the second ceremony, there I was under the canopy of the Milky Way. And what came to life was not what I was expecting with the sort of serpent-like DMT world of ayahuasca, but alchemical symbolism. Suddenly, 16th century alchemical symbolism came to life. And so I suddenly realized my soul, as you said, was the Athanor, and my body was the crucible. And every single night I was taken through the fires and distilled and calcinated and distilled and broken down and reformed and broken down and reformed. And the last image, the last feeling I had was at the end of all of this. And we were talking about how do we how do we apply this in the world around us, was the last lesson that came to me, and that image has sparked a remembrance of it, was that in order to extract gold from every situation that we're in, love is not some ethereal concept, but love is a physical tool that needs to be injected into every single situation in order to turn it from lead into gold. And it was just that image of the perfected heart and the love streaming out of it was just brought that back to life, because it's something I haven't thought about for a few years until this presentation, and how not being in any way an expert in alchemy, how that symbolism found me for that internal process. And I was just interested to know what your feelings were like, having done the physical work, and how that's interacted with you on an internal level.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for sharing that. It's always really nice when someone shares something that's obviously very personal. And I love, how the alchemical imagery came through to you when you did the ayahuasca retreat. It's pretty damn awesome.
Very unexpected.
Brilliant. That's what it's all about. So thank you for sharing that. The relationship between internal and external, I think I'd be a fool to answer that, because there are no words. And you'll know this from I think each and every one of us would have had these moments, and they're so sacred and they're so special, and words will get us so far, but they won't convey the experience. I'll just say it's the real deal. And I'll leave it at that. And I'm in another sense, for me, in my own journey, having profound personal experiences, it's this idea of the reddening, of the fixation of those states. We have these experiences, these epiphany moments, these moments of gnosis, of our pleromas exploding, and we experience the divine. How do we make that a fixed thing? And again, I touched on it earlier, this idea of the rose and the pelican, and the rose symbolizing that moment, that experience, that feeling, like you said, of the love, the projection. For me, love is the quintessence. That is what the underlying substance of all of this. That's what brings us here, which is enabling all of these things to happen. Yeah, I'm kind of a bit lost. I feel a bit all giddy. So thank you for reminding me of certain states. I do find this idea of the gold interesting. I was reminded of Egypt, and staring at the pyramids and wondering where the bloody cap is. Where's the capstone and what was it? And particularly like this idea of just Luxor, an idea of lux, of light, and an ore being gold, or the brick of gold. And for me, that projection really represents that capstone of that. It's the light of the gold more than the gold itself, and the light is the medium to which we perceive. Yeah.
Thank you.
A lot to unpack in that, Alex, that come to mind. I should have taken some notes whilst the thoughts were flowing as well, but I think it is, of course, you're right. It all boils down to that, but what does the word love mean and encapsulate itself? That is, it's kind of like the word weather. It covers a lot of different things, mostly that are experiential, and mostly that break apart the kind of attempts to define any of it. I think that is part of what we're doing here, is we're breaking apart the usual constructs in which we operate, that in many ways bind us to a particular view of reality, and it starts to unlock different ways of understanding our role in the cosmos. Psychedelics are, of course, one of the quickest ways to do that. And there are some people, P.D. Newman, I believe is his name, there's a book that he's written on his thesis that the alchemists were essentially synthesizing DMT and potentially other kinds of psychedelic compounds. There are thousands of them you can find through these processes. And I think this is an aside, I think there's an element of that. There are some kind of pharmacological avenues, in the thousands of years that these things were practiced, that would have led people to those kinds of experiences, and would have been seen as has been hypothesized, as an incredibly sacred substance with which you see the glory of God. And so I think it's a compelling argument, but at the same time, it kind of relies on a very explosive, ecstatic experience. Whereas I think all of us can start to understand that the true esoteric secrets are kind of hidden in plain sight, right? They're incredibly subtle. They're incredibly still, and they're within every interaction of every atom in the universe. So I think the psychedelic experience enables you to get a sense that your view of things is not the only way to perceive. And so I think it really can unlock things. I'm always fascinated when you say a lot of stuff comes to you that starts talking about collective unconsciousness and the Akashic record and all of these things esotericists have spoken about, of course. Where does all of this emerge from? What is the role of our consciousness? How do we align that consciousness to allow that to flow through us and not try and grasp it for ourselves? I think that's where love lies. In a lot of this, but it's incredibly subtle. That's the thing. That's the wonderful thing about all of this, is the deeper you go, the smaller you realize what you're looking for is, in some ways.
Thank you, Rob.
I just want to add one more thing onto what Rob said there, and I think it's really interesting because I mean this idea of utilizing substances, especially this is like a topic, like me and Rob have had this conversation at length over a pint, you know, about you know what can be created, and I'm always reminded of a conversation, Italian Rosicrucian tradition, talking about 3 different alchemical paths, more so in the internal sense. The first one being the empirical path, meaning that where we use a substance, an external substance that we might ingest in order to help us cross the river, shall we say, to take us to an altered state of consciousness. The problem is with that particular path, it's valid as it can bring about the experiences, but are we fixed or are we corpus mentum when we're in that state? Do we have control of it? I'm sure, you know, fortunately, it seems like you've made it back from an ayahuasca trip. I know people that haven't made it back from ayahuasca trips, at least for 10, 15 years. And I think it's this idea that through the empirical path, you don't have as much control over it. And you're relying on an external substance to recreate it. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it.
No, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly that it is a quick, quick route in. But what from what I never expected was the fact that it was alchemical symbolism that came through, and not something that should have been inherited to an indigenous culture in the Amazon. It was 16th century alchemical symbolism, which was, I found, you know, that's the last thing I expected, sitting in the middle of the jungle.
Well, that symbolism in some ways in your blood, right? So it's in your DNA as well, and that is in some ways what is coming through in those kinds of experiences.
Exactly. Anyway, thank you, gents.
Thank you. We have several other hands up at the moment. So Alex, back to you, please. Alex, are you there?
I'm muted, Alex.
Other
Alex. Sorry.
Other Alex. Yes,
Alex. No, Alex with an I.
Yeah, that's this one, right? So I just wanted to say that the symbolism you get is the symbolism you expect. It's your filter. But that's not my comment. My comment is, what is the underlying essence, the underlying substance of all form? It's light. It's light. It's the force behind the form. And even in Kabbalah, we know that, right? We know that behind all form, there is the universal light. Okay, so it's light that is the attractive force of the universe, because it's light that keeps everything cohesive. You can call it etheric energy, you can call it astral light, you can call it light of intelligence, whatever level you're talking about, monadic light, there is light. And I think that the idea of attraction, which we call love in the human word, is at all levels, exists at all levels. So there's the attraction of the elements, there's attraction of the electrons to the nucleus, there's the attraction of the human to the human, there's the attraction of the planet to the sun. So this attraction is what keeps everything cohesive. Now, we as emotional beings call it love, because that's the word we use. But it's this dynamic light that keeps everything in form and moving. That's my opinion.
Absolutely, and I'm sure Alistair can tell us where the source of this is from, but there is obviously the alchemical idea that what we're doing is turning matter into light. So yes.
Yeah, I don't. The source I got it from was from Patrick Riviere. He still rest in peace. He spoke a lot about, I guess, from the Fultonelli tradition of the work of the alchemist is to turn matter into light, and that's very much how I kind of see it and experience it. The source, I'm not sure.
Okay, Swami, I don't know whether I should refer to you as Swami or Atma or all three.
Most people call me Atma because it's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, Atma, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful talk. It's set my heart and my mind on fire. So I've enjoyed it very much indeed. The mention was before of two books. I'm not yet a member of the Rosicrucian order. I'm looking forward to that. But this crowning of nature would appear to be an example of one of those books. So you've described it as a process for an acidic method. I think, did you describe it as an acidic method, acerbic method of ascetic method of finding the philosopher's stone. But you might find that the book itself is that. So that the end of the story, the process is part of the end, let's say. So Martin alluded to this, I think, when he mentioned about this Lullian approach of contemplating the symbols. There's lots of different kinds of the texts. The Mathnavi of Rumi would be considered to be a way to the philosopher's stone, the Synthesis of Patanjali, and so on. And we have, in relation to those, what some people call a criterion, a Quran or a Torah. And Alex mentioned the potential of atomic fusion, and someone else said, "Oh, here's my body's the crucible and my soul's the athanor." So this would be the moment as they're trying to work to create this sustainable energy. We have a physical machine, but a large part of it is a very strong electromagnetic barrier to stop the plasma from burning everything up. So I think whatever I'm trying to say, that whatever you look into specifically, whether it's this text of the crowning of nature, or whether it's the Mathnavi, or whatever your personal way forwards is, that's your second book, and I think it's a wonderful group here that's finding this in all these different ways. What's wonderful and what I've found very helpful here is, coming from obviously a yogic background, these processes in alchemy from the crowning of nature cast some really useful light on an internal alchemical process that I find in Kashmir Shaivism and Advaita Vedanta. So I'd like to thank you very much for that, and maybe some of those comments about seeing this philosophy in lots of different places, it would be helpful to shine a light for some people. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I mean, I would just kind of reiterate again, I think ultimately what we're dealing with here are processes that enable us to find and experience a meeting point between consciousness and reality. And that will take an infinite variety of form.
It's worth mentioning, maybe it might be of interest for you to explore, Atma, is some of the work of Schwaller de Lubitsch. There's a memoir, Alchemy, and it's quite an interesting insight into Schwaller and his thought process. And I think his idea that salt, or the physical element, is the juncture of reality, and it's in salt that we have that all of this exists in, and that is really, really, really important. I think you might quite like that work.
thank you. If you could put a link or an ISBN, that'd be fantastic.
So, do we have any other questions or observations or comments, please, for the presenters today? If so, please go ahead and either speak or put your hand up first. That would be great. Otherwise, if we don't, then it looks like we may have come to a natural conclusion of the meeting today. Last chance, anybody? Okay. So, yeah, on behalf of the Metropolitan Study Group of the SRIA and everybody who's attended this meeting from all over the world, I'd like to express a huge thank you to both presenters, Rob and Alistair. That was an absolutely phenomenal presentation. Like I said earlier, so much work has gone into this. And the lovely thing I feel is that this opens up a very broad topic of conversation. And I would say that the people gathered at the Atlantis bookstore, for instance, if you go to have something to eat and a drink together afterward, I'm somewhat envious of that because of being able to sit and continue the conversation, because I think the subject matter has really opened up a very broad topic for further exploration in the coming years. And I look forward to this very much in all its different aspects. So if you'd like to say a final anything, Rob and Alistair, please go ahead.
Do you want to go first, Rob?
All right. I mean, we are continuing our explorations in these areas, and we also are very aware that the alchemical tradition, in a very practical operative sense, in the West, has been kind of nurtured in many ways by Rosicrucian circles and orders and things like that. And there are many, many people within the SRA and wider Rosicrucian circles that are doing this to a great, maybe a great deal, definitely a great deal further than I or even Alistair have so far achieved. This work is going on and it's fruitful, it's replicable, it's part of the tradition. So what we wanted to do here today was just tell people that, remind people that it's there, and that there are ways into it. I think for me, it's easy in some ways to fall back on the idea that, okay, we're talking about an internal process and I can map that with various kind of theurgic states or other things, because I think a lot of people, myself included, feel the operative side of it is just too impenetrable. But it's in that operative side that you start to really experience the internal change. And so I think that's what we're here to try and remind people of, remind ourselves of, and place all of that as Rosicrucians within a sacred context as well, because this is about our relationship with the divine ultimately.
I just really want to say, firstly, excuse the technical errors at the beginning. So thank you for your patience throughout the presentation. And thank you all for allowing me to speak, and particularly to Frater Rob for sending me that message and, inviting me to embark on this journey. For a long time, I've been looking for a vehicle for my practical work, having already had an interest in the Lullian Ripleyan tradition. Really, this set of emblems is remarkable, and I do look forward to kind of exploring it further, and it more than likely will be a lifetime's worth of work. So yeah, and if there's anyone that is interested in the operative work, because we understand, I kind of looked at it for ages and was like, not going to start, reach out to Rob or to myself and just have a chat. For me, I'd love to see Rosicrucians across the world doing more alchemy and making it accessible and going back to the ancient tradition, really to the heart of it, and less just restore it somewhat to the crowning of nature. Thank you.
Wonderful. So finally, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's attended the meeting today, for all of your questions and comments, and for your presence in general. And yeah, thanks once again to both our presenters. And we look forward to everybody joining us for our October meeting of the Metropolitan Study Group. So lots of love to everyone. Take good care, and onwards and upwards ever. Thank you very much, everyone.
Guys.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. Enjoy London. I'm jealous we can't be there. So God bless all. See you next time.